Haig Beck and Jackie Cooper, I was strictly told by them not to speak a lot on their works and achievements. However, I could not help myself then, and even more, willing to disagree even today. Haig Beck studied architecture at the AA and started working for A+D in the 70s and edited some of the finest issues which address polemical aspects of architecture. Some of them were Roma Interior, Oma, and Paris 1900. His interest both in the history of architecture and contemporary works were featured later in their new journal called International Architect, which were read by both architects and students all over the world. They published this magazine till 1986. Later they moved their base to Australia and ultimately to one of the finest islands near Queensland, where they commenced UME in 1996, and 22 issues are published already. They featured work of many young contemporary practitioners, and as editors during the time, this were read all over as well. During this time in Australia, he also taught at the University of Melbourne. Some of those students came to Sac University a couple of years ago as an exchange program. Jackie Cooper helped Dennis Crompton at the AA in the communication department, where she met Haig Beck, and since then working together. She's one of those editors who works such in detail that until and unless an appropriate word is not found, she would not let go her text. Trying to find out the hidden meaning from the text of the author is quite a task. It's like finding a needle in the forest. Together they published also several monographs on individual architects, and recently one of the finest and most authoritative volume on architect landmarker. And those who have not seen, I would highly recommend that they should see it immediately. And it is one of the finest graphically designed books too. However, I like to narrate two incidents to show their attitudes towards life. One, recently when I visited them on their beautiful island in Australia, and we decided to take a walk on the beach. Jackie Cooper took a small bag, and on the beach I saw her bending down to pick up something to put in her bag. Due to this, we went ahead, and this went on for quite some time, making us quite ahead of her. I wondered and gazed that she was picking up some shells from the sea sand. Out of curiosity to see these shells, I stayed behind and walked with her. I saw what? She was picking up used cigarette butts thrown by visitors on the beach to keep it free and clean. And this is her routine during everyday walks. Number two, now they have decided to launch the UME publication online, free for all, to download and read. Something very unique that I think as an editor. As they say, it is in their blood to be editors, and those two acts are indeed proof of the same. To put all the books on the web free for anyone to download, all old issues as well as the new ones which are going to come, and keeping their island clean and picking up someone else's debris. I think, and so many others, together they also think that they make one of the finest architectural editor team that we have in present times. We are indeed very happy that they have come specially to give today's presentation, and we look forward to having their views. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sneha. And it's a pleasure and an honour for us to return here to SET. And we thank all our friends in Ahmedabad who've invited us here to give this address tonight. Publishing architecture and building discourse. Want to say?
I just want to say a word or two. I've known Sneha for a very long time, we have. In fact, he was our assistant on international architecture when he was a graduate student at the Architectural Association. So it's a long, long history, and I've watched him develop. And through him, I've come to love India. And so I think this is true for Jamie too. I think this is our fifth trip back. And we think it's certainly the beginning of our experience of this beautiful, wonderful, exciting country. I really am so pleased to be here. Thank you. Jack.
Okay. We call this talk Publishing Architecture and Building Discourse, which has a certain ironic ring. It's a talk about editing and publishing architecture magazines, and specifically our architecture magazines. And there have been three.
Next.
architectural design,
Next.
international architect,
Next.
and Yumi, which is our current publication. As editors of each of these magazines in turn, we have operated from within the context of a particular place and time.
Next.
With AD, that context was London in the 1970s. For architecture and also for culture generally, the 1970s was a moment of upheaval. Living in London from 1969, we experienced the tectonic shift away from the establishment way of doing things, the proper way, you might say, to a liberalised, rebellious, experimental outlook that deconstructed the fixed worldview of our parents and grandparents. That's how Britain was in the 1960s and 70s. Architecture changed radically in this period. International modernism slipped from the pinnacle of vitality it had occupied for decades throughout the 20th century. And by the late 1960s, it seemed to be inappropriate and irrelevant, a style out of step with new ideas and thinking. With our second magazine, International Architect, the place was still London, but the time was the early to mid-1980s, the period that cemented Margaret Thatcher's regime and a protracted era of economic and social decline for the Brits. But the early 1980s also was the most exciting time for architecture.
Next.
The Architectural Association School was at its zenith. The world's best and brightest teachers and students created an extraordinary hothouse of thinking and activity, masterminded by the school's charismatic chairman, Albert Boyarsky. During those years of the 1980s, the AA was our home away from home, and as architectural culture flourished there, so did we.
This is a typical day at the AA in 1971, and over here is Albert Boyarsky. Here is Sam Stevens, the great engineering teacher. Tony William, one of the junior members of Archigram. We get a sense here, this is Wednesday, this is a typical day of what was available in the school, going on at that school. What was also interesting about the way in which the place ran is you could go to any lecture. Everybody went to any lecture. And they were packed. It was a wonderful time to be there.
Our third magazine, Yumi, was launched into very different circumstances. We were back in Australia, now on the edge of the world, not at the centre, and it was the 1990s. We had returned home in 1986 from the excitement of London to the small-scale, far-flung architectural cultures of Sydney and Melbourne. Australians are not an intellectual people. We are, as you would all know, a sporting nation. It was difficult to locate in Australia a vigorous architectural discourse. But despite that, we began to find some Australian architects as fine and creative and significant as the best architects we had met anywhere else in the world.
Next.
And in the early 1990s, we were able to create a small niche in which to operate as independent editors and publishers of a new magazine, Yumi.
Next.
And since 2000, the place where we have produced Yumi is a small subtropical island off the coast of Brisbane, as far away from the centre of the world as you could wish for. So that's the introduction to this talk. Now we invite you to cast your imaginations all the way back to London in 1976. That's when Haig was appointed as an editor of AD, and our editorial journey began. During the 1970s, there was rapid and radical technological, social and cultural change. In the late 1960s, swinging London had exploded established traditions and projected youth culture to a place of preeminence it had never before occupied. Music changed, fashion changed, art changed, journalism changed. Now also, the first personal computers were coming onto the market, can you imagine? There was women's liberation, political awareness, and also the earliest serious inklings of the limits to reserves of natural resources, especially oil. People began, dimly at first, to perceive why we should conserve the environment to ensure our survival.
Next.
Buckminster Fuller was our guru. The American engineer taught our generation that we are on spaceship Earth, with all the supplies of the journey already on board. While this radical and liberating cultural change was big, especially in England and the west coast of America, it was India that cast a powerfully seductive and mysterious influence over the West.
Next.
Our contemporaries went off on long journeys of personal and spiritual discovery to places like Goa or Pushkar, searching for meaning, wisdom, and perhaps nirvana, or just a good time. India was on the hippie trail. Interest burgeoned in mysticism, meditation, yoga, and mind-altering drugs. Back then, we were living and producing architectural design in London, with these intertwined activities centred around the AA school, where our friends and colleagues were Archigram, Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, David Chipperfield, James Sterling, Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Cedric Price, Will Alsop, Bernard Toomey, Leon Krier, Charles James, Jan Kapliski, Ron Arad, and so many others. And visiting architects from overseas honed in on the AA: Michael Graves, Richard Meyer, Charles Bothby, Henri Siriani, Jean Nouvel, Charles and Ray Eames, Bruce Goff, Louis Kahn, and Bucky Fuller, whose packed lectures lasted for 4 or 5 hours. The AA was the most exhilarating, stimulating architectural centre on the planet, and it was from here that we drew inspiration and content for our magazines, first AD and later International Architect. Haig and I were both destined, or at least well qualified, to make magazines.
Next.
As an architecture student in Brisbane,
That's me.
Haig had produced several issues of an architectural magazine with cultural pretensions called Scarab. His idea of being a student, and an architect for that matter, was to explore ideas and extend his knowledge of everything that affects architecture: history, technology, art, philosophy. As an editor, he has never lost that curiosity. And I, daughter of an architect who had trained at the AA in the early 50s, studied communications in London for 3 years. On graduating in 1972, I went to work in the AA's new communications unit.
Next.
Videoing lectures and events and making exhibition catalogues.
This is how primitive it was in those days. This is the young Jackie Cooper behind the cameraman. And over here, you can see it's December 1971. You can get a fair idea of sort of technology we were working with in those days and the advances that have occurred. In those days, if you wanted to make a digital tape, it literally was made on a metal tape here, and you physically splice the bits together. It was very difficult.
Very crude. And when Haig took over AD, in the absence of staff for some of the time, naturally I helped sub-edit and craft texts I could spell.
I still can't.
We were in the right place at the right time, London in the 1970s. This was when technological change hit magazine print production like a freight train, and the changes that resulted enabled us to operate as editors with very few resources. One day, a prestigious publication like Architectural Design
Next.
was being set in hot metal, which is the traditional and laborious way that newspapers, books and magazines were printed since the days of Gutenberg. Hot metal required many hands and lots of money. Then suddenly, for the next issue, we could typeset the galleys ourselves using the new Golf Ball typewriter. So quick and direct, and far fewer people were needed.
So this is literally, these are only a couple of issues apart. This is the old AD, and this is the new AD that went back in 1970, back in 1971. I'm amused by this cover because it's got a lot of the stars from the AA here, including Peter Cook, you can see down here. This is Elton Boyarsky, the caricature over here. Tony Williams, we mentioned before. This is Raina Bannon here. Sam Stevens here. I mean, it was a very amusing time, and I think this rather crazy cover typifies the sort of the new AD that was made a comic book standard almost.
So there really was a technological revolution, and it meant that print production became much, much cheaper and simpler. And that was just as well, because 6 weeks after Haig was appointed as a joint editor of Architectural Design with Martin Spring, the owners announced that they planned to sell the magazine to a commercial publisher with a string of other titles. They had a building housing all the editors on cubicles on one floor, and all the sub-editors and designers on the floor below, with economy being the only measure of success that mattered. Publishing was rationalised in the 1960s, And in 1976, AD was finally being confronted with the new reality of standardised production norms. But Haig and his co-editor rebelled. They didn't want to become trained mice in a large anonymous economic treadmill. So they set about raising money from within the architectural profession to buy AD and keep it independent. And they succeeded. But it was tough. There was no money and production standards dropped. The magazine went to low-quality paper and shed more than half its subscribers as a result. And then Haig and Martin unwittingly delivered AD into the hands of a cunning publisher, who ultimately fired Martin and permitted Haig editorial freedom only until AD proved financially successful. And then he refused to allow Haig to develop or change his by now proven editorial formula of thematic issues. So at that point, in 1979, Haig and I stepped away from AD and independently launched our own magazine, International Architect, which we produced for 6 years. Now, we have titled this talk, Building Discourse. What do we mean by discourse, and what is the role of architectural magazines? It was Michel Foucault who identified the concept of a discourse. Roy Landau, for many years head of the Architectural Association Graduate School, explained discourse in an essay we published in UIA International Architects No. 5 in 1984 called British Architecture, the Culture of Architecture, a historiography of the current discourse. And I will quote, "We learn and inform through making statements in a discourse. Architectural discourse has a scope which involves words and objects, and such objects may be projects as well as built artifacts. The scope of the architectural discourse is not bounded by words. Contributions to architectural discourse take place through many sorts of exchanges, which involve different sorts of actors, far beyond the community of architectural designers, patrons of architecture, professional, cultural and educational institutions, journals and the media, the critic, historian and writer, even craftsmen, all possess the capacity for making and shaping architectural discourse." Unquote. Editors participate in architectural discourse through the architects and works they choose to publish or not publish, the ideas and tendencies they promote or ignore, and through the texts they commission and those they write.
This is, I think, on reflection, 35, 40 years of architectural publishing, the most important thing we ever did, this issue. I'm pleased to say that within about 6 or 8 months, it'll be up online, free online, and other people can read it. But in it, it's an issue which was guest edited by Roy Landau, and he sets forward the arguments for not only how a discourse operates in architecture, but more importantly, in this issue, he describes the way architects think as designers and the way a design philosophy evolves. And I think that really it's probably the most, as I said, the most important bit of writing probably of the latter part of the 20th century, because it tells us how we do things.
In London, when we took over AD in 1976, there were several strands to the architectural discourse. A shift had occurred in the late 1950s and early 1960s away from the CIAM-driven modernist reconstruction of war-torn Europe to a discourse that looked towards a technological future.
Next.
Archigram's visionary work of the 1960s typified this. By the late 1960s, the rise of the counterculture, the youth movements, added a new strand to the discourse that was also technological, but related to what came to be known as alternative technology. Self-sufficiency was important, and also political autonomy. Wind farms and solar energy were being proposed. A radical American publication, the Whole Earth Catalogue, was packed with practical information to enable middle-class dropouts to survive on self-sufficient farms and communes, building mud brick walls, baking bread and planting vegetable gardens. In London, we baked our own wholemeal bread. This alternative technology strand of the discourse was one among several, and at the time we didn't accord it leading significance. But now, with the hindsight of 35 years, we see the alternative technology discourse as a continuum, and it is still actively operating, and this is evident in a country like India. Recently, alternative technology has been widely revived around the world. reaction to the demonstrable phenomenon of climate change. It's become really the main question of our times: how we can generate energy and at the same time reduce our carbon footprint. In so-called developed countries like Australia, there is much debate and tension over this. We have perhaps the largest carbon footprint per capita in the world in Australia, but our population is relatively small. So many Australians think that excuses us from not doing anything. Nevertheless, quite a lot of Australians are installing solar panels on their roofs and limiting their consumption of water, and doing what they can. This echoes the spirit of autonomy and responsibility that informed the alternative technology discourse we were so familiar with in the 1970s.
It's amusing to think that this was published more than 35 years ago, and here we have, I just opened this page up and it fell open at this page, frankly, when I was scanning it, and I realised it had fallen open at a spread where we have various types of solar collectors, mainly for hot water conditions. But over here, which I found absolutely amazing, 35 years ago, here's the first time I ever encountered solar electricity generating cells. So what we now take for granted, this was absolutely brand new, cutting edge, still impossible hippie technology 35 years ago.
This alternative self-sufficient orientation was the cultural background when Haig and Martin took over the reins at NED. The magazine had been carrying on the discourse on alternative technology, and this continued under their editorship.
Next.
They published issues and articles on the autonomous house,
Next.
on alternative approaches to human settlement,
Next.
and radical, or what became known as alternative technology. In 1977, Haig and Martin jointly edited an issue of AD that identified radical changes in architecture since the previous decade.
Next.
Volte-face was the title of this issue. It documented fundamental shifts in the modernist architectural paradigm. Modernism had come to signify all that was wrong with the anonymous corporatized world.
This is a drawing by Fred Scott, and it should be familiar to you because this is Roy painted down here. Bruegel painting, I'm sorry, down here, collaged on top of a core drawing, and he titled his article that he wrote for us "The Clean Aesthetic," but which is a reference, of course, to Paul. But what he's done is he's actually put in the true human condition into a core space, and he called it the clean anesthetic, which I thought was quite witty. And it's it typified quite extremely the sort of shift that occurred around about this time. Here's our editorial we're writing here about the various types, and this is an example here that I've taken of a very young Norman Foster looking at the sorts of issues about a naturally ventilated solar access building 35, 40 years ago.
There was widespread public rejection of comprehensive redevelopment of inner city areas. This is again part of the revulsion against modernism. Large-scale slum renewal programs were reviled. In contrast to these soulless monolithic architectural impositions, there was self-help, rehabilitation, small-scale technologies based on renewable resources, recycling, vernacular styles, delegation of control away from professionals to communities. And all these affected how architects thought and operate. And I must say, I think that list sounds remarkably contemporary, even though it's 35, 40 years old. While he was editor between 1976 and 1979, Haig published an extraordinary and wide array of themes in AD.
Next.
There was an issue on the Beaux-Arts.
Next.
And one on London 1900.
I put these two issues in to really reveal the extent to which the volte-face had occurred at that point. When I arrived in London just a few years before, I was blind to these buildings. There was nothing that had prepared me as a young architectural student reading my Bannister Fletcher for this sort of stuff, which was there, right there in front of my eyes, and yet absolutely I couldn't see it. And what had happened in that short period around about the early 1970s is suddenly we became aware of another architecture that had been so recent. So this issue here on London 1900 which was particularly dealt with that architecture, which was most terribly reviled by the early modernists in London. And of course, the issue that we did on the Beaux-Arts, which was a big conference held at the Architectural Association at that time, and again, a totally revival period of architecture for the modernists, early modernists. So I put it here to show the way things were shifting at that moment.
Next, please. A whole issue was devoted to a single building, the new Centre Pompidou in Paris, which included 5 interpretations from 5 writers, all different.
Now that's a pretty... we were exploring with my friend, who is a professor of Australian literature in Sydney, Ida Rendick. We were, as young men and our partners, we were exploring this idea that there were multiple interpretations. At that point, you could make... critics generally thought that their task was to find the true interpretation, the authentic interpretation of a particular text or of a building. And we were beginning to, and he was doing work for his doctoral thesis under George Steiner, and he'd come to the conclusion, which was the subject of his thesis, that in fact actually each interpretation was actually a reflection of the interpreter, not of the author. And once more, they reflected the time. There are no Freudian interpretations before Freud, for instance. And so for us it was an interesting concept that we would take a group of critics to Paris to collectively each write a critical appraisal of the Centre Pompidou. And there were 5. We think it's probably the first time that this was attempted.
Next, please. An issue on the eccentric works of Bruce Bloch. This was the first time Haig published working drawings, actual blueprints, in fact. No magazine of the time printed working drawings.
Next.
An issue called Urban Transformations was written by Rodrigo Perez Darce with an introduction by Leo Krier and showed how certain types of large urban forms become armatures for densification of the urban fabric.
Again, this was part of the critique of mid-20th century modernism. And Rodrigo had observed that the social densification of modern space was a critical issue that had to be addressed. And like Leo Krier, he did a series of theoretical propositions, but he did them as drawn statements, not as written statements, which I think this is the way architects work and think. So these are true architects working theoretically about issues that are important to architecture. And he took, as one of his many examples, he took Chandigarh, which I'm yet to go and see, and I go to see on Monday, and I'm looking forward to it. But as I understand, the critique is that these spaces are so vast that they actually have an antisocial, an alienating experience to them. And what he's proposing here is the urban social densification of Chandigarh as one of his theoretical propositions.
Next, please. Leo Krier proposed the urban model of the convivial European neighbourhood, where inhabitants lived, walked to school or work, to shops, theatres, parks and places of worship, without needing cars.
Next.
Haig published an issue on Omar when Rem was still a tutor at the AA and included a chapter from his uncompleted book, Delirious New York. This eclectic and diverse editorial exploration of ideas was possible because for about 10 years from the late 1960s, architects did not build in England because the economy was broken. Throughout this building drought, architects thought, taught, wrote, drew, taught. They developed theory. At about this moment, we became aware of the eclectic modernism of the Japanese architect Arata Isazaki. Haig asked our friend Charles Jenks to write a theoretical critique of this eclectic trend for an issue which he titled Radical Eclecticism. Jenks had recently completed a doctorate supervised by Rainer Banham on meaning in architecture. So Haig asked him to develop these ideas and his take on radical eclecticism into a book that would be published by AD. Charles came back a few months later with a draft that turned into something else entirely, called The Language of Postmodern Architecture.
Next.
He had originally identified the radical eclecticism as radical eclecticism, the work of the 19th century Catalan mystic Antonio Gaudí, who invested his buildings with esoteric formal and political messages. In the 1970s, a general question was being asked by figures of the AA, such as Jenks, Robert Venturi, Tony Vidler, and Peter Eisenman. Is there meaning in architecture? In the language of postmodern architecture, Jenks set out to show that there was, and many architects accepted this simplistic notion that architectural form can be designed to mean something in a literal sense. The times were right for postmodernism to take hold. By the late 1970s, many architects were ready to reject the sterility of modernism, leaving the way clear for postmodernism to become a pervasive and powerful stylistic influence. In fact, there was almost a frenzy to be freed from modernist strictures and to embrace the new paradigms for form-making. Architects indiscriminately raided history and nature. They embraced expressionism. They experimented with formal invention. With postmodernism, architects blundered blindly into historicism, pasting on pediments and attaching non-functional hollow columns to facades. As a style, postmodernism often resulted in shallow visual one-liners. But postmodernism was also an important development for two reasons. It liberated the form-making imaginations of architects, and it generated renewed interest in history and provided a foundation for contextualist studies.
Next.
Contextualism in the 1970s was a new urban idea generated from Europe, especially France, and it treated the urban organism or urban fabric as a whole entity into which buildings and places were to be inserted sympathetically, as opposed to imagining a site as a tabula rasa where any size or shape or scale of structure, of any material and colour, could be proposed, regardless of the neighbouring context. Architecture, contextualism proposed, had a responsibility to respond to, or defy if necessary, the particular place and history and context in which it was located, not simply to create self-referential built objects.
Now, Peter Cook had opened up a small art gallery around the corner from the AA, and he would hold events there. And one of them was to have an intellectual rally. And so we went along to the rally, and this issue of AD was the result. One of the nice things about being an editor of an architectural magazine and on the treadmill of a relatively regular publishing schedule was that you had to respond very swiftly to opportunities, and that is really quite a pleasure. But here you can see we've Andrew Holmes, who's a wonderful draftsman and a very witty one, has done here are Alison and Peter Smithson, here is Raina Banham, here is Peter Cook in his glasses. Here is an absent American, he's there. This is Arata Mizazaki, who was there. Here we can see Cedric Price smoking his cigar. Here is James Sterling, who was there, Sterling and Gowan. So it's a witty sort of take. But we were sitting outside, it was the middle of summer in London, which is a lovely time of year. David Dunster, who was a fellow editor of another magazine, Architectural Monographs, we were sitting together, and Graham Shane, Dr. Graham Shane, who was also our generation, we were very young, we were in our early 30s, came up and said, we were having a beer outside on the footpath, and he's outside the rally, and Graham Shane came up and said, I've just come back from Paris yesterday, it's fantastic there. He said, they're all talking about contextualism. And we both looked at him and said, what's that? I mean, and I say it like this because we had no idea. In 1976 or thereabouts, 77, it wasn't a concept, a theoretical concept that was widely understood by architects, Anglo-speaking, Anglo-English architects. And so we immediately said to Graham, boy, that sounds really interesting. Do you think you could write an essay for me for AD that explains it? So in that issue, he wrote this. He wrote an introduction to contextualism, what it meant, and what the French were doing, and he also gave some very nice examples. He went to Cologne and showed what's happening in Germany. So this is this idea about the way in which editors build discourse. I mean, quite by chance, you suddenly find yourself with an opportunity and you respond to it. Next.
Architecture magazines provided the catalyst for the theory being developed during these years in England when architects did not build. It was a time of paper architecture.
So, as part of the volte-face investigation that went on at about this moment at AD, we were concerned about the fact that in the 1950s and the post-war reconstruction that happened in Europe, Corb's vision of an industrialised methods for prefabricating and producing social housing was realised, and we were wondering, well, it was around until the 70s sometime, and then it sort of stopped. We lost interest in it. So we we asked Andrew Rabinick actually to do an issue for us on whatever happened to the systems approach, which was an investigation into the type of why this had gone off the radar of the discourse. Next, please. At the same time, we were so intrigued by what Graham Shane had said about what was going on in France. We went to Paris, and in those days, very few French architects spoke English. They all speak English now. And so we went to our friend Antoine Grumbach, who did speak English, and said, "Will you help us get that issue?" And so this is the issue that he put together. And what was interesting is that Grumbach said, our take on the French Parisian, French take on architecture at that point from his generation was that architecture the practice was actually part of the outcome of a theoretical position, and that the practice was actually a laboratory. And he saw all the work that was going on in France at that time by his generation as sort of laboratory work. So we called it the laboratories. And these are the sorts of issues that were being raised. You can see, Bruno Fortier, the sort of people who were Francois Charlin, the best architectural journalist of the time. These are the sorts of people who are writing for us in the issue. The next, please. While we're in Paris, we did a map guide. Now, there's a long tradition of map guides in AD that stretch back maybe from the late 1940s forward. AD always produced map guides, and we were just continuing that tradition. Of course, there's a great temptation to make your map guide, the one you're doing, bigger and better than anybody else's. I think we went right over the top on this one. This one over here is Rome. This is a guide to Mannerist architecture in Rome. Next, please. And as I was saying before, there was a sort of a level of opportunism that as an editor I was confronted with, and so the Hayward Gallery was putting together a major exhibition on surrealism in London, and we were all sitting around over dinner one night talking about this exhibition that was about to open, and we thought, wouldn't it be a nice idea to try and track the connections between surrealism and architecture? And at that time, probably one of the great scholars and intellectuals in London was the Czech Dalibor Vesely, who was well known to have had a terrible writer's block and hadn't written for 10 years at that time. So I went to Dalibor and said, "Will you write this?" So surrealism unblocked him, and he wrote this fabulous introduction to the issue. And you can get an idea of the sorts of people who. Roger Cardinal, we've got over here Bernard Tschumi, Kenneth Franklin. It's a wonderful place to be in London at that time. Next, please. This is really the last issue of AD. Here is the drawing I commissioned for the front cover, and I had a run-in with the publisher, who said, "This guy can't draw. I mean, he's a terrible draftsman. Why would you want to put that on your cover?" And he dived into his coat pocket and pulled out this really terrible photograph slide, grubby slide. He said, "Charlie Jenks, he published Charlie Jenks' books. He said, Charlie has just given me this slide. I want you to put that on the cover." So I put it on the cover, walked back, agreed to put it on the cover, walked back to the office. It was the last thing you do is do the cover in the magazine. We walked back to the office and cleared the desk. We'd had enough of it by then. However, working with Joseph Ripworth, the really great intellectual and scholar in England, was a wonderful experience. I went to Joseph and said, I've heard that there's a new drawing by the only extant drawing of Alberti's has been discovered, and by Howard Burns. He said, "Yes, this is a fantastic thing." He said, "Should we do an issue on it?" And so we did an issue on Alberti. And I can remember, and you can see, this is the pulling power of somebody like Joseph Ripworth. Look at the names we've got up there that he pulled in. I couldn't do that. And this is one of the nice things about being a young editor. These were fabulous seminars from the best brains in the world in architecture. And I can remember going to Joseph's house to finalise some aspect of the text that we were putting together, and going into his sitting room up in St John's Wood, and it was a big room, maybe almost the size of 2/3 the size of this little pit here, big room, and it was full of books in stacks, not only on the walls but in stacks like this. And there were two big leather ottomans. You couldn't sit on them because there were books stacked on top of the seats. There were books everywhere. And Joseph, who likes to show off a bit, started to make some very arcane references to the work that we were doing. And to support it, he said, I've got a text here somewhere. I can give you a quote. And sort of dived into a pile of books and pulled something out, flipped it open, and started to read the quote to me. And what a show! I mean, I was about this big. It really made me feel. But the funny thing was that after he'd actually showed off, he then said, look, he said, I want to show you something else. And he pulled out an old roll of drawings, and it was his working drawings for a house that he'd done, well, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years before. What was really important for Joseph, for me to understand, not that he was a great thinker in architecture, that was just showing off. What he was earnest about was he was an architect. First and foremost, he was an architect, and he wanted me to understand, these are the drawings, I did this, I do this. So I think this is, for me, this was a very important moment of understanding the people I was working with.
And it's significant that most of these architectural thinkers were architects who had practice, and they talked about how to make architecture, and that doesn't happen anymore. Today's architectural theoreticians tend to hang their ideas on the hat stands of other disciplines, such as literature or linguistics or feminist theory or post-colonialism, or whatever other fashionable ism is current. Have you noticed? In the latter 1970s, Britain discovered oil in the North Sea, and the British economy took off, and architects began to build again. Now, in the spirit of this exciting new architectural era, Haig wanted to change the editorial direction of AD and move from paper architecture to publishing real buildings. At that point, however, he came up against the publisher, who did not want to alter the economically successful editorial formula of thematic issues, so we simply left AD. That was in May 1979, and we launched International Architect immediately.
Next.
By this time, print production technology had improved even further, and we could self-sufficiently typeset and produce the magazine ready for the printer from the basement of our home in Hackney in East London, which Snehal came to know well when he worked with us a few years later. International Architect carried no advertising. This was intentional. We've always had a philosophical objection to advertising because it unduly influences editorial content and distorts the fundamental raison d'etre of publishing. Check out the masthead of most magazines and you will see the advertising staff outweigh editorial staff. Wherever that occurs, the magazine's raison d'etre is to make money. But we wanted to publish architecture, not make a vehicle for selling concrete or furniture. So there was no advertising in International Architect, and we relied solely on subscriptions and bookshop sales. We struggled to print each issue because although production costs had come down, the print bill for each issue was roughly the equivalent of a mortgage on a small house. But we were editorially independent, and finally we could produce the magazine we wanted without interference. For an editor, that is the biggest privilege. Our editorial focus on International Architect was on building.
Next.
And especially regional manifestations of modernism and architecture based on tectonics.
This is an issue which, I think it's issue number 7, and I went to America and to see Robert Venturi, and he gave me the drawings to this house, the working drawings to this house. And at the same time, about the same time, I got to James Gowan and got the drawings of about similar scale house, and one that was sort of similar in some respects, formally, but English. And I began to realise, looking at the working drawings, that this was quintessentially an English set of working drawings. I mean, and for those of us who, from my generation, will remember actually doing coloured working drawings that were coloured up to represent the various materials. So this is Gowan making a set of working drawings for a house in England, and using the sort of the traditional construction drawing, working drawing presentation techniques. Next. But then here we have Robert Venturi doing a house, and Franco Perini in Rome doing a house. The Perini house is in Sicily, and what's interesting is that the Italians didn't have a highly developed notion of the architect as a professional. They were still exploring what that meant in the post-war period leading up into the early 1970s. And so when we see Perini doing what he considered to be a set of working drawings, there are also a set of presentation drawings, and one which actually explained the formal tectonics as well as the structural tectonics of the building. So it's a very interesting, totally different cultural take on how you do a set of production drawings. Where on the other hand, we look at Robert Venturi, and I was looking at these drawings, and with his assistant who was responsible for the working drawings, and I said to him, "This is a timber house, and all the details are done for it's a postmodern house, and all the details are to do with timber detailing as you might find in the late 18th century in America." But when I looked closely at it, I could see, in fact, that the structure was steel. And I said, "How can you do a timber house and it's steel?" He said, "Well, the contractor came to us and said, I can do this for so much cheaper if I put a steel structure up, and I just put the timber mouldings onto the steel. And it'll be okay, you won't know it's steel inside." And to me that exemplified American pragmatism. Absolutely exemplified. So this is this idea of cultural positions that are taken up by in different countries about how we make our architectural production.
Regionalist transformations of modernism was a strand of the discourse in those early years we were producing International Architect, and one that Kenneth Frampton would also espouse. He called it critical regionalism. Frampton is also an unambiguous champion of tectonics. Both regionalism and tectonics were somewhat contentious at the time, and they still are. They arose as elements of the architectural discourse at the moment when postmodernism was flourishing, and both regionalism and tectonics were seen as antagonistic to the fake historicism and form-making freedoms that postmodernism sanctioned. And then later, regionalism and tectonics were to compete with the beguiling form-making possibilities of the new computer-generated architecture, which released architectural form from tectonic logic and structural expression and gave us fractal geometries and blob architecture. International Architect was a remarkably fresh, optimistic, intelligent publication. It was beautifully designed, and uniquely we devoted a generous amount of space to each work. Buildings were displayed over 6, 8, or 10 pages. Another thing we did in International Architect was feature young, unknown architects alongside more established names.
Next.
It's hard to believe now, but Rem Koolhaas was once unknown, and we published him alongside the very well-known Richard Meyer and Richard Rogers.
Next.
We published Frank Gehry, unknown at the time, alongside Alva Aalto.
Next.
We sandwiched an unknown Will Alsop between Michael Graves and Colin St. John Wilson.
Next.
Mario Botta was yet to attain international significance when we published him in the same issue as the monumental James Sterling. Editorially, International Architect showed the way for other publications like the more staid, predictable, and establishment-oriented Architectural Review. International Architect wasn't the only exciting architecture magazine of the times. In England, Blueprint was launched by another former AD editor, Peter Murray. It was a tabloid newspaper format with punchy graphics and cheerful copy. 9H was a serious experimental theory publication produced by a group of ex-students from the Bath that we were friendly with. In New York, we saw oppositions come and go, a distinguished theory magazine edited at one time by Peter Eisenman, who keenly observed that publications have a useful life of 8 issues. That's because it takes 3 or 4 issues for an editor to find out what he has to say, and then it takes a few more issues. After a few more issues, he or she has said it all, and then after that, the magazine should fold. Good advice, but we haven't followed it. But we noticed that we periodically made major editorial changes of direction, or we launched another magazine. Also in New York, Andrew McNair launched a spate of stylish architectural publications, including Skyline and Metropolis. After publishing 9 issues of International Architect, we were approached by the president of the UIA, the corporate Spaniard Rafael de la Hoz, who proposed linking our magazine to the UIA, which is the International Union of Architects. the UIA had wanted to publish a magazine called International Architect, and were put out to discover that that was already our title. But if we agreed to add UIA to the masthead, they would undertake to raise sponsorship for a series of regional issues. That proposition chimed in with our growing interest in modern regional architecture, an editorial change of direction we were already planning.
Next.
And it was prefigured with an issue of International Architect on Swedish proto-modernism. So we agreed, and we embarked on a series of great issues of UIA International Architect.
Next.
On France,
Next.
Madrid,
Oh, and of course, I can't resist doing a map guide, so we did a map guide to Madrid. Next.
Southern Africa,
You can see the influence of Khan on Southern African architects here. Next.
Malaysia,
Real problems they were having in Malaysia about how you actually make an architecture in a modern state that reflected a vernacular culture. And you can see the sorts of issues that they're grappling with here. And this rather beautiful house based on vernacular principles by Jimmy Ling. Next.
Australia,
Next.
Egypt,
This is a lovely issue. My assistant, our assistant at that time was Graham Yarn, another Australian, young Australian. He returned to Australia. He was at one point an assistant to James Sterling. Another moment he was an assistant to Zaha Hadid. He was a boy who flew quite high. And he had also been Glenn Merkin's only assistant at one point as well. And we went off to Cairo together to make this issue. And while we were waiting to get some various permits and approvals to get into buildings, he went around and did this fabulous typological analysis of the Muslim buildings of Cairo. It's still the best work I know of for anybody going to Egypt, and it'll be up on the web in 6 months' time. And so before you go to Cairo next time, make sure you download it and have a look. Next, please. Oh, and Graham went to Israel with me as well, and he did a wonderful guide to Israeli architecture. And what's interesting about Israel, we discovered, is that at the end of the Weimar period, when the Nazis came to power, the Jewish architects many of the Jewish architects in Germany fled to Israel, still then in Palestine, and there they established Weimar on the desert sands of the Mediterranean. It's really a very interesting aspect of Israeli architecture. Next. Yes, okay.
we were in Madrid collecting material for the Madrid
Could you
issue
go back, please? I'm sorry. I did that.
of UIA International Architect when a group of former students launched El Coquis. And we were phenomenally impressed because the pro-architecture Latin culture of Spain swamped the first print run, which sold out 7,000 copies in Madrid alone. This set them up financially to publish future issues and become an international publishing force, which is still going. We never had a print run that exceeded 2,000 copies. In Anglo-Saxon England, it was always an effort to warm up the culture. Architecture magazines were not greeted with acclaim as they are in Spain, France, and Italy. In all, we published 18 issues of International Architect between 1979 and 1986. And there might have been more, but the UIA Secretariat of Paris insulted us by sending an officious letter demanding we sign over our rights to International Architect to the UIA. We certainly would not. International Architect was always our magazine, after all. So we just stopped, and we decided to return to Australia. We were tired. We were tired of British grey skies and the economic austerity. We were tired of the great effort it took to raise funds and publish each issue, and also to distribute the magazine. We did all that ourselves. And so we decided it was time to go home. That was in early 1986. We didn't publish a magazine for another 10 years. We had left London with a container load of production equipment and back issues, ready to continue International Architect from Australia. But we learned the terrible truth. Publishing momentum demands a cultural critical mass. In Australia at that time, so far from the source and centre of architectural culture, and with such a small population and so few architects, there was no critical mass. But we did not stop dreaming of magazines. It was in our blood.
Next.
And we decided to make a little experimental magazine on a photocopy machine, but make it better than any other little architecture magazine in the world by turning it into a handcrafted artwork. In 1990, we made 3 Yumi portfolios by hand as a small-scale photocopy production, feeding each page individually through the photocopier several times to build up colour, density and graphic effects, experimenting with paper, including butter paper and tracing paper, which were very tricky, especially in the humid conditions of the Sydney summer, because they would wrinkle and not take the ink. The pages were specially designed by Australia's foremost graphic designer, Gary Emery.
Next.
The loose leaves of each portfolio were held in paper folders and kept in a cedar box with an aluminium lid, etched with a sketch of the Sydney Opera House, which was done by Barry Marshall of Denton Corker Marshall. The lid was a reference to the metal plates used for hot metal printing, and the cedar of the box was the same material used to make drawing boards. Haig found the last man in Melbourne who still made drawing boards. So that places us in an era that is gone. The pages are square. We like the landscape format that 2 square pages produce as a spread. It's good for showing architecture properly. The process was laborious, and it was so laborious that it was only possible to produce 100 copies of each of the 3 Yumi portfolios, and they became collector's items. Glenn Murcutt hand-coloured 100 drawings for his portfolio, and Alex Popoff made a page of small sketches for his. So there's very much the sense of the architectural hand and also the craft involved in producing these portfolios. From these 3 boxed issues of Yumi, we built a fully fledged printed publication. Yumi 1 appeared in 1996, once again designed by Gary, and it was published 10 years after the last issue of International Architect. By then, Apple Desktop Publishing was just beginning, and we discovered we could undertake the entire preprint production by ourselves, as we had been doing with a photocopy machine. So instead of the 4 or 5 people who'd been necessary to produce International Architect in London, now we could do it all by ourselves to a professional commercial standard.
We were very lucky because when I first went to Melbourne University as deputy head, Peter McIntyre, the professor then, decided in fact actually that he would make sure that the architecture school, this was in 1987, 88, would be the first architectural school in Australia that was fully equipped with computers, and he set up computers a long time ago. And of course in those days, I can remember all the computers in our computer lab were 64-bit RAM machines. Can you remember what that was like? And also they were all Apple machines, which was wonderful. And I can remember when I became professor at Melbourne, I was given an establishment grant by the university, and I used the money to buy the necessary technology to start making architectural publications. And I know that my first decent computer was 128-bit RAM. Nothing. I mean, compared to what we do now with 6 or 8 gig of RAM on a machine. And it was just at that moment when Quark was being introduced. Now it's been surpassed completely by InDesign, the Adobe product. But we used Quark and Adobe products, very, very ancient ones. They work beautifully on these little computers. And we could produce stuff like this. And it literally took 2 of us to do it.
So Yumi is about architects working drawings. We combine a regionalist interest in Australian and international architecture. We have published many celebrated architects, including...
Next. Look, I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. Here we've got Mario Botta and Glenn Murcutt. I mean, 2 masters of tectonic expression. One lightweight, one heavyweight. Next one, please. And here, 2 artists who are architects. On one side, Will Bruder, the American architect, and on the other, Zaha. Next. Here we have really unusual tectonics on the part of Stephen Hall on the far side over there. This is the little church, Roman Catholic church, which is all done in tilt slab. So to take a technology which is essentially considered to be industrial and very low grade, and to turn it into a gem of a little church is quite an interesting thing. And over here, I mean, the great master of fiddling with the program and getting something extra out of it, from Cool House, here he takes a house for a paraplegic and turns it into this wonderful thing. Of course, you can all go and see these on the web. They're easily available. Next, please. And of course, here are the two great poets of high tech. Richard Rogers on this side over here, and his former partner Renzo Piano over there. Next, please. And here is two projects in Spain. One by Alberto Campo Baeza from Madrid, and you can see here's an architect who's absolutely locked into the Misesian rationalist tradition. And over here, the English poetic architect David Chipperfield building in Madrid. Next, please. And here we have Kengo Kuma over here. This is a remarkable and bizarre building. It's in China. It's a guest house looking out towards the Great Wall. It's nearly all apparently made with bamboo. And the bits which are not bamboo are glass. So here is a detail. This is the detail here of this wall. There is a structure inside here, but it apparently is inside the glass is full of duck down. So the building looks like it's held up by duck down. Those bits which aren't bamboo. And over here, of course, Hideo Ando building a temple, which is a traditional temple, built in the traditional manner, but a good abstracted timber stick approach. Next, please. Two Americans. Obviously, Frank Gehry and one of his crazy sketches for, and this is for the Los Angeles Philharmonic Hall. And over here, Eric Owen Moss, another Los Angeles architect, with their wonderful sort of pochade space. You know, this is an American sort of sensibility operating here. Next, please.
And we've also published many architects who are less well known internationally.
So here we have Kitayama and
Nazreen Saraji.
Thank you, Jack. I can't pronounce it either. And what Ko does here is he takes off-the-shelf technology, and so does Nazreen. They go over the top of each other like this. And the reason that happens is because it's a school. It's a school of music which had to deal with both philharmonic music, classical music, as well as pop music. And the parents of the students that were going to the philharmonic bit were actually putting up most of the money, and they did not want their kids mixing with the kids who were doing rap. And so the architect convinced them that in fact actually he could make two buildings that overlapped them like this, and they would be separate. What he didn't tell them is at the point where they overlapped, he made it so they were totally communicating between each other. And over here, this is
Victor Marty.
It's just a beautiful little building, a sports hall. Next, please.
Francesco Cellini.
I put Francesco Cellini, who was one of the great Italian draftsmen. This is a project in Venice, very beautiful project in Venice. And I sort of put it in to sort of show this notion of an architectural rendering and the way in which actually how beautiful they can be and how convincing they can be. And over here, this is a project by Richard Francis Jones, now built for the new architecture school at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And here, this is the worst client any architect would ever have, is a faculty of architecture. And these are the drawings that he made to try and convince the faculty members that this really was it is quite an intriguing building in terms of its solar energy response techniques, cross ventilation, and all the rest of it. But these are some of the drawings he did to try and convince the faculty. He succeeded eventually. Next, please. Sort of the drawings that architects make. Barry Marshall, of Denton Corker Marshall, makes sketches like this, in which he actually, this is a sketch which is made for his architectural drafting staff. And this is how he wants it to look. And so he goes through here and makes all these notes, and then somebody else actually converts that into a set of working drawings. And here we have a very interesting project by another Australian architect, by chance here. Here it was a vineyard, and the architect was doodling with the idea about the way in which vines are grafted onto different stocks, and so he was looking at the thought of that that could actually be a formal poetic basis for making the architecture. And so you can see the two bits being grafted together here.
This is John Wardle.
Next, please. I put this page up mainly because I wanted to point out, this is Gary Emery's typography, the great Australian graphic designer and typographer, and just how beautiful his typography is, how simple and clean it is. And I put this up, this image up here, architect.
Tyro Nishizawa.
Mainly because, I mean, an elegant little building, just a box, but down here, I mean, even to my way of thinking, even a carport, which is what this is, with a vegetable garden on top of it, but even this structural idea of the carport was worthy of a set of working drawings to show, just to show how things were being made. Next, please. And this is Rick Joy in Phoenix, Arizona, the most poetic, I think, of all American architects that are practicing at the moment. He set out to be a rock drummer. He opened for Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, and he realised at about that point that he wasn't going to make it. He thought he'd better find something else to do. And we're all the benefactors of that. He decided the architect. And this is Tony Fenton in London. Just a very...
Tony Fenton.
Sorry. And a very beautiful set of working drawing details, as only the English will do them. Next, please. Again, I'm always interested in I've always been interested in lightweight architecture because I come from a lightweight timber tradition where I was brought up as a kid. So I'm always intrigued, not only by that, but also by heavyweight as well. But here it was interesting to juxtapose an architect in Nova Scotia in Canada on the Atlantic coast using a timber balloon frame system, and an architect in Japan with their take on the timber balloon frame.
That's Hitoshi Yen and Brian McKay Lyons.
Next, please. And I have a very, Romelda Joglu is a very important friend of mine, and I was enormously happy when he said to me, would I like to publish his own house, and this is his own house here, and one of his drawings. I have a great love of Romelda, who's supported me many, many years. Okay.
So in each case, as with International Architect, we lavish space on the work. We include the salient drawings, specifically the architect's working drawings, graphically edited to clarify information and intent. We write discursive commentaries that combine cultural and technical critiques. We publish in order to make clear the architectural intentions of the work and to draw the reader into a collaboration whereby the artifact as built can be assembled in the architect-reader's mind, its form and materiality inferred from the two-dimensional representations. In UMI, we present architectural drawings as devices for reverie. And if that should sound pretentious, we start from the position of explaining how architecture is built, the pragmatics. For that reason, we preferentially publish built works, not projects. We don't know of any other publication that follows a similar editorial path or publishes working drawings. In 35 years of making architectural magazines, it still surprises us that no other publication does what we do. And maybe that has to do with who produces architecture magazines. Nowadays, it's usually not architects. Architecture magazines, by and large, exist for reasons other than architecture. Their driving motive is commercial, or it's to publish academic theory, not the design nuts and bolts of practice. Architecture is portrayed as a style or lifestyle. It's glossy images, architecture as a commodity. Our instinct to refuse to carry advertising has been right for us. It has enabled us to publish what we want, the way we want, without compromise. And that has made International Architect and UMI absolutely distinctive in the world of architectural publishing. The 22 issues of UMI we have produced to date, and the 18 issues of International Architect, and our previous issues of AD, constitute a singular editorial signature, a body of editorial and architectural thought that doesn't date, that isn't subject to fashion, and is timeless in the way that it speaks directly to architects. Now, one of the satisfactions of preparing the 18 issues of International Architect and to put up on the UMI website, which Haig has been working on lately, several months, has been to look at all that work again and realise how fresh and relevant it remains. And now with UMI we've undertaken yet another change in editorial direction. This has been made possible by the internet and online publishing, and the fact that we now give away UMI free. This means that we have no particular readership to satisfy in the way that we had to think of who would buy the magazine when we were printing UMI. Each print run was so expensive that we had to consider how it would sell. But we don't print hard copy issues anymore, so we can indulge ourselves in what we choose to publish. We write for an architectural audience, and we always have our reader in mind. But now we can afford to work only on the things that interest us, in the hope that they might interest others too. There is 35 years of thinking about architecture behind every editorial decision we make, and that 35 years informs our current choices and interests. Whatever we decide to publish, even if it might be arcane or marginal, there are some architects, academics and students who'd be interested too. So the first of these issues of UMI that reflects our latest change in editorial direction, which indulges the editors, is UMI 22, the current issue. It's nearly 300 pages long and presents the oeuvre of Anderson O'Gorman, an Australian practice, indeed a Brisbane practice. Both Britt Anderson and Peter O'Gorman were inspirational teachers. Britt is our first Australian gold medalist. Our first Australian woman gold medalist. She's also an old friend from the AA days, and she's a neighbour on Stradbroke Island.
Next.
While this issue of UMI is free online, this is UMI 22, we also made a limited edition of 50 copies collected in a box like the original UMI. But this time, instead of hand-printing each page on a photocopier, we gave the PDF files to a digital printer. The next issue of UMI, UMI 23, which we're currently working on, is about the stepwells and water structures of Western India.
Next.
Water architecture, upside-down cathedrals. It's Snehal Shah's research of 30 years that some of you will be familiar with. Haig and I have enjoyed working again with Snehal, this time to edit his material and bring it together into a UMI format. Like all our editions, UMI 23 will be available free online as PDF downloads. And who knows what we'll produce after that. Perhaps we'll make a map guide of the timber and stone architecture of Himachal Pradesh. As we have found there is hardly any coherent architectural information available about this marvellous architecture, and we're going there next week to see it for ourselves. We're enjoying playing with the possibilities for publishing that online UMI offers. An online publication can be as many or as few pages as you wish. So we can go from publishing an issue as large as a book to one that is relatively brief and might deal with just a single idea or building. And in theory, though we haven't done this yet, you could add to an issue or article you published a while ago, which of course you cannot go back and do with a print publication. We'd like to end with a very important point, which is that the internet provides the most powerful tool for building architectural discourse and for disseminating ideas. There are great opportunities for architectural publishing online, and for a young generation with energy and a vision for the future, it is a fantastic time to be publishing. We look at a culture like India's, with so many participants and with so much going on, and see that many voices could be exploiting and shaping this medium and producing vibrant digital architectural publications. And to make a really fine architectural magazine, you don't need to mortgage your house anymore. Thank you.
Shortly after I graduated, and I went off to work for an architect as a young graduate architect with a view to getting my professional practice exams and setting up practice. I discovered after about 6 months that making architecture was too slow for me. And I mean, I needed to do it, whatever I needed to do, I needed to do it much quicker than making a building. So I never did. And then so I took up to writing, which I've always been interested in. And then when I really got serious about architectural publishing, I realised, in fact, that there's a covenant that exists between the editor and the architect, that you're publishing, and you break that covenant if you try to publish or try to do your own work. So I've made my own house, and she still thinks it's okay. And I made a house for my builder because he made such a beautiful, and you saw a picture of it, he made such a beautiful job of it, that he said, can I have one just like yours, but it has to be not 1 story high, but 2 stories high, and it has to be like this and like that. So I made him a sort of a house like mine, and that's about the. And I'm doing a little shit for Jackie's sister, a studio for Jackie's sister. That's it.
And the boat.
Look, a boat is a boat I can build. You know, that has nothing to do with architecture. So you can't be an editor and be an architect. You need to be based in architecture too, and I was very fortunate. I had a great training, practical training in architecture, where I went to work for an architect in the daytime, went to school at night. In fact, actually, when I went to the AA and I couldn't afford to pay the fees, they were very kind to me and they said, you can tutor a building construction, which was rather nice. And in fact, many years later, Ramkur said to me, hey, you tutored me in brick veneer construction. I was tutoring somebody in my own unit. I know it's hard to ask questions, but we're going to have a cup of tea or something later.
Well, I'd like to thank both Haig and Jackie. First of all, thank both of you for doing many things for us today. You have conveyed to us and our students a kind of passion that has lasted 40 years, an intelligence and an alertness with which that passion is fueled, an ability to express that. And I think all of us are inspired in some way, in many different ways, by this lecture. You've also given us a sort of potted history of architecture in the last 40 years, which has been a very exciting and varied history also, which we have all been through, but the students have not. And I think it's very important that they saw this journey. And I would recommend that you go upstairs and see the ADs, and then go to the net and see Umi, and we'll see the whole history of architecture unfolding there. Thank you very much for doing this for us. And as I said before your lecture, I would like very much to declare you friends of SET.
Thank you.
Equally, I'm really happy to see so many of us gathered together here today, who are not only students, but also alumni. People who have studied here and who have shown a great love for this institution. I speak now not as an alumni, but I'm really appreciated, greatly touched, and I think all of us are touched by this tremendous new institution that is being created, the Faculty of Architecture Alumni Association, whose first important activity has been to bring to us this lecture series every year. Thank you very much, all those who have been behind this wonderful new initiative. Thank you. I think we would like to give Haig and Jackie a little something from our students and our faculty and our alumni as something to carry back home.